علموني هني علموني على حبك فتحوا لي عيوني.
Professor Suleiman Mourad is Professor of Religion at Smith College. Research focuses on early Islamic history and religious thought, including the sanctity of Jerusalem. He is the author of Early Islam Between Myth and History, Al-Hasan al-Basri, and the formation of his legacy in classical Islamic scholarship. To begin with, I'll start with a quick question. Could you tell us a bit about the two major streams from which Muslim veneration of Jerusalem emerged?
Thank you, Mr. Jamal, for hosting me on this episode. Significance of Jerusalem in Islam emanated from two strains, if one were to use that term. One is the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the other one is what we can refer to as this emerging and rising new religion of Islam that started in Western Arabia. And in 638, when the Muslims conquered the Near East and occupied Jerusalem, they start establishing their own experiences there, their own history there. And therefore, the symbolism of Jerusalem started to take meanings in relation to this new emerging religion. So here we are talking about two strains, the Judeo-Christian and the nascent Islamic. That's a very important question. And often many scholars actually start with the Quran and what we broadly refer to as a biography, the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, certain references that have been taken or arguably indicate in one way or another Jerusalem. So if we start with the Quran, there are several references to the broad geography that we call the Holy Land. In the Quran and in the Islamic tradition, to a large extent, the expression, the Holy Land, references the Judeo-Christian Holy Land in Palestine. The Hijaz is not usually referenced as Islam's Holy Land. Actually, such an idea in Islam does not exist for the most part. Mecca and Medina are sacred sites, but they don't form part of an Islamic Holy Land there, so to speak. From an Islamic perspective, the Holy Land is the classical Holy Land in Palestine. And the Quran references that a lot. It calls it the Holy Land or the land that God blessed. In several places in the Quran, there is a number of references and stories that are told about biblical prophets and biblical figures. Abraham, David, Solomon, Jesus, John the Baptist, Mary. So there is a lot of that. Even when Moses brought the ancient Israelites out of Egypt and into the promised land, the Quran references that story and speaks about it. And therefore, there are lots of this kind of broad indication to that geography. But when it comes to the city of Jerusalem in particular, there is not a single direct reference or mention of it in the Quran. And that is a little bit of a problem. There is a verse in 17:1, Surah al-Isra, or the Night Journey, which speaks of God making the Prophet journey by night from the Haram Mosque in Mecca to a farthest mosque somewhere that the Quran does not specify or clarify where. The problem there is that this reference, Masjid al-Aqsa, the farthest mosque, if we want to say it is Jerusalem, the Quran does not actually identify Jerusalem by that name anywhere to say that this means Jerusalem. As far as we can tell, Jerusalem was never known among the Arabs in that reference. Also, there was no structure of that nature anywhere in Jerusalem yet. So is this a reference to a holy site, a sacred site that is simply a spot rather than an actual building? again, the Quran does not clarify any of that. And you add to this the fact that the early Muslims, when they were reflecting on the meaning of that verse, they were not in agreement what was its location and its indication. So some said, oh, the farthest mosque is Jerusalem, but others said, no, the farthest mosque is somewhere in heaven, or the farthest mosque is somewhere close to Mecca. So you have that kind of disagreement among the early Muslim scholars who reflected on this verse, all of which point us in the direction that very likely that started to become associated, that is the expression al-Masjid al-Aqsa started to become associated with Jerusalem at a much later period than during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. If we move from that, for instance, to other stories that we find in the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, and here I'm going to start with a third element that some people argue it is in the Quran, and that is the change of the Qibla. The legend says that the Muslims used to pray in the direction of Jerusalem until God instructed them to change the direction of prayer, Qibla, to Mecca. But if we look at the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, the cow, which is the second chapter in the Quran, verses 142 till 153, actually it doesn't say at all where the first Qibla was, so that we can determine from it its specific place. It only speaks about changing the direction of the Qibla from an unspecified first Qibla to the Mecca, to the Kaaba in particular. But to know more about that, we have to go to the Sunnah or to the biography of the Prophet Muhammad in order to gain more information. But the problem there is that this is already a century and a half after the Muslims conquered Jerusalem, after the Prophet died, and we are not certain whether the association with Jerusalem was inserted at a later period or identified at a later period, or whether actually it goes all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad. That's always the problem with working with the hadith literature and the biography of the Prophet, is that the date of its compilation, the date of the compilation of the early hadith books is from the late 8th century, half to late 8th century. And therefore, we are not sure whether this information remained intact exactly the way it was first circulated, or it went through processes of some addition, some elimination, some changes, etc., etc. So as scholars, we are unable to, at this point, take the biography of the Prophet from the mid to late 8th century and after as actually verbatim what unfolded at the time of the Prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century. So that's a big hurdle, a big problem in our work as scholars in assessing whether these references to Jerusalem are correct or inserted at a later period. The Quran doesn't actually mention Jerusalem by name, and whatever mentions that we have taken for a long period of time as references to Jerusalem are not actually that conclusive. They are speculative. And the biography of the Prophet Muhammad is from much later period. It includes a lot of contradictions as well, associating with the issue of the Qibla, there is no much debate, but with the issue of the night journey, there is debate even in the biography of the Prophet as to where he journeyed. And finally, the third element is ascension to heaven, supposedly that the Prophet underwent when he was still in Mecca. Again, here, there is no direct Quranic reference to an ascension to heaven. There are some speculation that there is an indication in Surah An-Najm, the star, where there could be some discussion of it, but when you read the text there, it speaks of a vision that supposedly, again, we don't know exactly who had that vision, but often we interpret those things to have happened to the Prophet Muhammad. So in that particular case, that vision happened while the Prophet was still on earth, and he saw something in the sky in front of him. This is not a heavenly journey at all. So the story of the heavenly journey, the ascension, Mi'raj, comes to us again from the hadith and from the seerah of the Prophet, from the biographies of the Prophet. And there you really get into a huge disagreement, contradictions, because on the one hand, most scholars dissociated the ascension to heaven from the night journey. They were not the same event. They didn't occur even in the same year. They both happened sometime when the Prophet was still in Mecca, but we don't know exactly when. Some suggest the night journey happened in 617, while the ascension in 619. So there is approximately 2-year difference between them. And also, if we look at the earliest biography of the Prophet Muhammad by Ibn Ishaq, who died 767, this is already the second half of the 8th century. Ibn Ishaq tells us very clearly that he was editing different stories and made them into one. And this is the first time we see the story of the night journey and the story of the ascension conflated and redrafted into one narrative. If we look at the archaeology of that story, in other words, we see his work of trying to bring together two stories that otherwise existed separately. So the idea that the Prophet Muhammad journeyed to Jerusalem as part of this Isra night journey, and from Jerusalem he ascended to heaven, is definitely post-construction of the Dome of the Rock, definitely not before it. So it's definitely not from the 7th century. It's from a much later century. So these are the three main stories that essentially bring, in one way, if you want to say, the Quran and the biography of Prophet Muhammad to Jerusalem.
Fascinating. Let's continue now with the story that most Muslims will be familiar with, and that is the second Caliph Umar negotiating the terms of surrender of Jerusalem and cleansing the Temple Mount. But what can you tell us of the incident from a historical point of view? And I wonder if the same problems you highlighted, I wonder if those same problems pervade the narrative of...
Somehow, yes, a little bit to a lesser extent, and that is largely because you have here much more corroborating evidence that comes from different directions. The problem often with the seerah in particular, the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, is that invariably it doesn't have corroborating evidence outside of it. If we move to the story of Caliph Umar, we start seeing a little bit of corroborating evidence there that it could have happened, although some scholars still argue that this is probably more of a fantasy, more of an invented story than actually happened. The story that often is told is that the Muslims in 638, when they started the conquest of the Near East, which, by the way, was not a religious conquest at all. All the evidence at our disposal show beyond any doubt that this conquest was more of a political conquest. You could also say population conquest, in the sense that peoples from Arabia started to spread outside, but definitely it wasn't a religious conquest, because the Muslims were absolutely not interested in converting anybody outside of the Arabian Peninsula to Islam. And when they start occupying, say, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, as far as we can tell, in the 1st century of Islam, they were very unreceptive to others converting to Islam. So, and that tells us a great deal that the conquest was not meant as a religious conquest. Two, it wasn't even bloody, in the sense that we don't archaeologically find any destruction in this period. And often whatever destruction that we see in Syria, Palestine, Egypt is datable to the Persian conquest that was in 614. That's approximately 20 years or so before. This has a great bearing on Jerusalem when the Muslims laid siege to it in 638. And that is the local population realized that the Muslims are not there to destroy the city of Jerusalem, and therefore they could enter with them into some kind of an agreement, except that according to the Christian sources that we have from roughly around that period, is that the Patriarch of Jerusalem insisted that the leader of the Muslims must be present in order to ratify the agreement between the two parties. Hence, the military leader of the conquest of Syria wrote to Caliph Umar and asked him to come, and Caliph Umar came. The details about actually what happened when the Caliph Umar came, there you could see some embellishment that were added to the story in order to create a mega story out of it. And there you could be, in a way, as a historian, a little bit critical of certain details. But the broad archaeology of that story, that is, the main veins of that story, are telling in that this is largely what the Muslims were doing everywhere else, whether it is Damascus, whether it is Alexandria, or the pre-Islamic Cairo, whether it is the major towns in even Iraq. Actually, there was very little occupation of those places, and often the Muslims decided or opted to live outside those places. So when the Muslims were eager, for instance, to capture Jerusalem, they didn't kick out the local population and replace it with immigrant Muslims. For the most part, very, very few Muslims lived in Jerusalem. And for the most part, even up till the 19th century, Jerusalem largely remained a predominantly Christian city. We often forget about that fact, that Jerusalem, throughout Islamic history, was never a majority Muslim. It was largely a majority Christian, with some presence of Jews as well at different periods. So the Muslim sources also corroborate here. So you have here Christian sources and Muslim sources speaking of the Caliph of the Muslims coming, or the head of the Muslims coming to conclude this kind of treaty. And while he was there, he toured the city, and this is a little bit uncertain and inconclusive historiographically, but he made a visit to the Holy Sepulchre, according to the legend. Possibly he prayed there or prayed in its courtyard. If you go to Jerusalem, there is a mosque called the Mosque of Umar outside the Holy Sepulchre. And the local people believe that he prayed there and not inside the Holy Sepulchre. But we know from the practice of the early Muslims at that time that they used to go to Christian churches and pray in Christian churches. But that is because they did not yet have their own mosques. So they identify churches as possible places of worship. Obviously, they are not worshiping there as Christians, absolutely not. Or they are not joining the Christians for a communal worship together. But we know from, for instance, the Church of John the Baptist in Damascus, which is the main church in Damascus, and became later the Umayyad Mosque, the Muslims started praying there, and gradually they took half of it and turned it into mosque. And later on, the Umayyad Caliph al-Walid bought it all from the Christians and turned it into the Umayyad Mosque, and the Christians were given another spot to build a different church there. The same happened with Aleppo, and there are indications from so many other places that actually in what is today Jordan and Palestine, that the Muslims used to go to churches to pray. So the fact that possibly when Umar came to Jerusalem at that time, not having any mosque, obviously, he could have prayed in the Holy Sepulchre. We know from Caliph Muawiyah, we'll talk about him a little later, that he at least came one time and went to the Holy Sepulchre and prayed there. So again, this is not something that wasn't was unknown or not done by the Muslims. The more important aspect of the legend of Caliph Umar's visit to Jerusalem is that this pact that he did that we call al-Uhd al-Umariyya, or the Pact of Umar, which guaranteed the rights of the Christians to keep managing and controlling the religious sites in Jerusalem, definitely the Holy Sepulchre and many other churches as well. And that came up much later, probably we'll talk about it in the course of our conversation today, came up later in the Crusader period when Saladin was discussing whether they should destroy the Holy Sepulchre or not. Many of his followers said, no, you can't do this. Many of his religious advisors said, no, you can't do this because of the Pact of Umar. That's a legal precedent. We cannot touch with this. And the most important facet of Umar's visit is supposedly he goes to the Temple Mount area, realizes that the Temple Mount is in utter ruin. It has been, part of it, used as a dump. So he ordered his followers, the generals, the Muslim generals, the Muslim army, everybody who was with him, to put aside their weapons, whatever they were carrying, and start cleaning the site. And they spent a couple of days actually cleaning the site with the focus on the sacred rock. We know about it from Jewish sources from before Islam. Even Hashtiyeh, its name in Hebrew, which is the foundation stone in English, and that Jewish pilgrims used to come to the Temple Mount to pray there in recognition of this destroyed temple that used to stand sometime there. And it is this foundation stone that the Muslims started to refer to as as-Sakhra, the rock, and ultimately later on, around 692, Caliph al-Malik built the Dome of the Rock. So the visit of Caliph Umar, if this is historic, and if that aspect of the detail is correct, here what we are seeing is the first clear Islamic association with Jerusalem based on its biblical legitimacy and biblical significance. That is, the Muslims realized that Jerusalem is the religious capital, the spiritual capital of monotheism. And as now the new rulers of Jerusalem, obviously in their opinion, Christians live in Jerusalem and Jews sanctified Jerusalem, right? And they have a presence in Jerusalem, so they have certain rights to the city. But Umar, for all practical purposes, was convinced that now the Muslims rule it as political leaders, and therefore it is them that they have now to be the sponsor, the guardians, the protectors of this new city, and therefore they inherit its biblical legacy. So the act of cleansing the Temple Mount is a statement to say that now here we are, the Muslims, and this is under our patronage now, since nobody is taking care of it. So the fact that the story is talking about the Temple Mount being a dump, it means that largely the dominant tradition that was in control of Jerusalem, which is Christianity and the Byzantines, decided that this place is no more important. And the Muslims came, realized that, and took it over. So all of this is pointing us to the fact of how much Judaism, Islam, and Christianity share in terms of their veneration of Jerusalem. That a specific spot might change its significance due to some certain religious reasons. The Christians, for the most part, at least officially, moved the sanctity of the old temple and Temple Mount from its location to this new place that is called the Holy Sepulchre, precisely because Jesus was crucified there and then buried there. And he resurrected and ascended to heaven, supposedly starting from that spot. So the Holy Sepulchre inherits all this symbolism, significance, spirituality of the old temple. And therefore, officially Christianity said, okay, the old temple is out of our radar. We focus on the new temple, so to speak. The Muslims came and said, we beg to defer. Or possibly you could also argue that they came and realized that the Christians are in control of the new temple. They said, okay, then the old temple, nobody takes care of it. We take care of it. And again, all of this points to that the Muslims right there tapped into this kind of ancient biblical history of Jerusalem and claimed themselves as part of it. And obviously, they are claiming themselves as part of it, meaning that they are not exclusively in control of it. They share it with others, but they are now the guardians in that perspective of them being the political rulers. The Umayyads, for the most part, more and more in the last 20 years or so, we are actually realizing the extensive role they played in forming what we call today Islam. We often have this idea that the Prophet Muhammad came, he shared his revelation, the revelation that he received, which I mean here, the Quran, with his followers, and he set up all the teachings and all the contours of the Islamic, of this new religion called Islam. But historically and scholarly, this is not correct at all. Islam is a product of the Muslims trying to make sense of the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, which they didn't agree about, and of the message that he brought, which also in early Islam, they were in disagreement about. Therefore, then when we look at really at the Umayyads, we find their imprints in the way that the Quran ended up being collected into an official codex and imposed on everybody else, and therefore the need to eliminate or other variants that existed at the time, or other codices that were in circulation. The imposition of a new shahada that, as far as we can tell, didn't exist before. The beginning of the creation of what we call a religious capital city for Islam. Today, obviously, we think Mecca is and has always been the religious capital city in Islam, but no, this is an Umayyad creation. But they seem to have started their experience with that with Jerusalem before they start investing in Mecca, and Mecca elevating itself to be the uncontested spiritual capital for Islam, was Medina second and Jerusalem second, in the sense that behind Mecca, I'm not talking here as Mecca taking the gold and Medina taking the silver and Jerusalem taking the bronze medal. No, it's more like they constitute a kind of spiritual trinity, if one were to use that expression. And therefore they are inseparable from each other. But the Umayyads ultimately were the first to invest in Jerusalem. And for some political reasons, by the end of the 7th century, beginning of the 8th century, they realized that it's better that they put their investments in Mecca. And this is when we start see politically Jerusalem starting to lose this competition with Mecca. But before that, Jerusalem seems to be the focus of the Umayyads in particular. And there we have lots of questions. Some of it we can explain on the basis of sources, other we can speculate about. But let's start with the actual fact that why would the Umayyads invest so much of their wealth and political capital in Jerusalem and not say in Mecca, given the fact that they belong to one of the most prestigious families of Mecca? Here, the answers are manifold. One, I go back to that point that I raised earlier. Jerusalem is the capital city of monotheism. And here you have a new emerging religion of Islam, yet not fully defined, very fluid, politically in charge of Jerusalem. And therefore, are the Muslims to lay claim to this as part of their legitimacy as true monotheists? or to shun it and go and invest somewhere else. The Umayyads decided that it's better for them to invest in the monotheistic capital of the Judeo-Christian Islamic, this kind of monotheistic world. And we see that exhibited in Muawiyah and definitely al-Malik later on. And with the Umayyads, actually, here we have uncontested both source and architecture that prove beyond the shadow of doubt that Muawiyah and the Umayyads were extremely involved in the city of Jerusalem. We have Christian sources from around 670 talking about Muawiyah coming to Jerusalem to get also this, to be declared Caliph. So you have Tabari, we have another scholar called al-Maqdisi, who was from a little bit after Tabari, also attesting to that. It was a different type of story that Muawiyah came to be declared Caliph in Jerusalem. The earlier Christian source called the Maronite Chronicle, which is from the late 7th, early 8th century, specified precisely that when Muawiyah came to Jerusalem, he went to the tomb of Mary, prayed there. It is in Gethsemane. There is a legend, a local legend, that Mary died and was buried in Jerusalem. The more official Christian legend is that she died in what is today Ephesus, near Izmir in Turkey. So you have lots of these competing stories. But nonetheless, there is actually a church today in Jerusalem, if one were to go, and it existed for a long period of time, since definitely the Byzantine period, where the local people say Mary is buried there. So Muawiyah went, made a prayer there. He then prayed in, as I said earlier, in the Holy Sepulchre in Golgotha, that is where Jesus was crucified. And after that, he went to the Haram, to the Temple Mount area, and got declared Caliph there. So the question is, why did Muawiyah come and prayed, and why did he choose Jerusalem to be crowned there and not say Damascus? He was a governor of Syria. His capital, political capital city was Damascus. Why did he come all the way to Jerusalem and bring everybody to Jerusalem to be declared Caliph? The issue here is that the Umayyads were extremely dependent on an Arab confederation of tribes who were Christians. And that remained for a long period time during Umayyad power. Ultimately, when the Abbasids took over, there was processes for varieties of reasons of conversion into Islam, and many of the Arab tribes in Syria ultimately adopted Islam. Ironically, many of them adopted Shia Islam before in the 12th century converting to Sunni Islam, but never, that's a different story. So those Arab tribes that formed the backbone of the Umayyad army and the Umayyad states considered Jerusalem as their spiritual city. And therefore did Muawiyah try to appeal to that sentimentality among a big constituency in his state and the backbone of his army and his empire. And that, by the way, could have influenced. Here you are talking about a minority of Arab Muslims ruling an empire, when actually the majority of the people of the population and the people who were running the affair of the state, helping them set up this Islamic empire, quote unquote, were actually Arab Christians or local Christians. So did they have a hand? Did they impact this early, still fluid Islamic understanding of what it means to be invested in a religious capital like Jerusalem? So that's another facet of it. Finally, as far as we can tell, it's still extremely debatable whether when Caliph Umar came, he ordered the construction of a mosque. The problem there is that the term that we use to refer to what is today the Aqsa Mosque is also the term that is used to refer to the entire Haram or Temple Mount. In most Muslim sources, early Muslim sources, there is tremendous confusion. When they actually say Aqsa Mosque, they mean the Haram. They don't mean a specific building. Even when Tabari says, for instance, Muawiyah came and was declared Caliph in the Aqsa Mosque, that Aqsa Mosque does not mean that there was a mosque building. He means by it the Temple Mount area. And we know that for sure because from exactly the same time as Tabari, there is a geographer, Ibn Hawqal, who said that on the Aqsa Mosque, there is a dome of the rock and there is a masjid, right? So he distinguished the mosque from the sanctuary. And therefore, the early references in this literature to the Aqsa Mosque is actually to a sanctuary, a broad sanctuary, rather than a specific building. And that's what, when we say that Caliph Umar built, again, this is a verb in Arabic, bana, Aqsa Mosque, does this mean constructed a building, or he started a process of renovating and cleansing this broad sanctuary that we call in English Temple Mount? That's very much actually what happened, is this the big sanctuary. And there, if we look at contemporary sources that speak of, again, Christian sources that speak of Muslims coming to Jerusalem to pray, they identify the place of the Muslims' prayer around what is today the Dome of the Rock, and not on the southern part of the Temple Mount of the Haram, where ultimately the mosque that we call the Aqsa Mosque was built. So that is one point. The other point is that the first structure that the Muslims built, which was built by Muawiyah, we are not certain whether this was during the time when he was governor or during the time when he was Caliph, that is in 640, 650 or 660 when he became Caliph. This is a Dome of the Chain, which is exactly in the center of this large Haram area. It's not accidental to mathematically, geometrically, to actually construct it exactly in the center. So that centrality of what we call Qubbat al-Silsila, Dome of the Chain, which scholars were confused to identify as a maquette that was built in order to provide the visual architecture of the Dome of the Rock. Actually, the two buildings are completely different. The Dome of the Chain is very, very small, and it's not at all anywhere close in its design or architecture to the Dome of the Rock. So it wasn't a treasury to keep the money while they were building the Dome of the Rock. It's definitely from the time of Muawiyah. And its name, Qubbat Silsila, alludes to a legend that this is a spot of judgment. And it has ties to biblical history, to a legend about Solomon holding court there and judging among the ancient Israelites, and also to the future day of judgment when God is going to hold the final judgment for humanity. So again, that Qubbat Silsila echoes a lot of these kind of Jerusalem being identified by the Muslims for varieties of reasons as an important spiritual capital, including its role in the day of judgment. And I'll talk about this much later. So here we have so many different factors that tie motives for why Muawiyah started his investment in Jerusalem, which triggered later on the Umayyads to make more investment in the city of Jerusalem. And essentially that kind of relationship was crowned in 692 when Caliph al-Malik ordered the construction of the Dome of the Rock. And there we see part of a larger investment in complete renovation of the entire Haram area and not simply one particular spot. So there is the building of the Dome of the Rock, and then whether al-Malik himself envisioned a mosque as well to be built, which came to be called the Aqsa Mosque, or whether his son, but often we need to treat al-Malik and his son al-Walid a period of approximately 30 years of rule between 685 and 715 as one continuation of almost the same reign, give and take. So there you see two major buildings that came actually to completely hegemonize the visual access to Jerusalem. If you come from three places, from the north, from the south, or from the east, the one thing that essentially captures your eyesight is the Haram, the Dome of the Rock, and to some extent the Aqsa Mosque. So obviously, visibly here, you have the Islamic imprint on Jerusalem. But the Umayyad were not only interested in two religious places there on the Haram. What we also see is that actually they built palaces for them on the southern side, south side and southwest side of the Haram area. And the archaeology is still there, the remains of those palaces there and administrative buildings. And that is something we don't know about, by the way, from the literary sources. We only know about it from archaeology, from the finds that we have seen there, that the archaeologists have discovered in the last, since 1960s for the most part. So here, all of a sudden, we are seeing an aspect that the literary sources did not at all talk about, and that is the palaces that Umayyad caliphs built. So Al-Walid had a palace in Jerusalem. We have papyri that speak that he built for himself, and the papyri actually only recently were discovered. So all of a sudden we have the Umayyads having palaces and therefore coming to Jerusalem. They have large administrative buildings. So what was really the role of Jerusalem in administrating Palestine or a larger geography around the city? All of this, we don't have much information from the sources about. But again, the archaeology tells us that the Umayyads were more invested in the city than we ever thought.
Another question I had was in regards to whether some of this investment by the Umayyads in the Holy Land region in Jerusalem was toward court narrators who would produce narration at the request of caliphs. You talked about this fluidity in the early period. And I wonder if that is true, how much of an effect did that investment have on later narrators and the works of the Fada'il genre, which you're going to tell us a bit about, and people like al-Ramli?
Fantastic. Yes. Often we don't take into account the impact of, say, pilgrimage and the economy around pilgrimage. That is, when pilgrims start coming to certain places, that creates some kind of a demand and supply and demand of lots of things. You know, you could silly speak of the souvenirs that the pilgrims want, but there is something else about this, that the more pilgrims come, the more sanctity you are going to invest in that place. And therefore, the pilgrims are going to come, visit, and they need to ask, you know, what's so special about this place? And you have guides there taking them from one place to another, and they need to explain to them. Possibly some of that could be exaggeration, invented, etc. You expect some of it, but that's how this economy around pilgrimage started to shape itself. And we have, especially when it comes to Jerusalem, we have tremendous examples from before Islam. If you look at the way the Christians, when they start to Christianize the Holy Land and Jerusalem in particular, we have accounts by pilgrims telling us, you know, when they came, they were taken around by guides, by monks, and they would take them to a spot and say, this spot is associated with so and so, and therefore you need to do a prayer, and they point to them what they should do, etc. So here you start having this kind of an economy, spiritual economy, that started to be built, and it highlights specific sites as being excessively sacred. And by extension, collectively, it becomes the entire city sacred. And that's exactly what happened in early Islam. And how much the Umayyad had direct role in engineering all of it, or some of it, we are not completely sure, but we know we have some stories that tell us that some of the scholars that were very influential in devising religious agenda of the Umayyads, one of them is this famous al-Zuhri, died in the early 8th century, 724, if I'm not mistaken, and who's an incredibly important historian in some way and hadith scholar in another way, that he probably was the first to try to tie the night journey of the Prophet Muhammad to the Dome of the Rock. We don't have solid evidence before that about him. And there is a famous story that when he came to Jerusalem, he went to listen to a narrator who was describing the religious merits of Jerusalem. And that person kept going and talking about different religious importance of the city of Jerusalem. but never mentioned the verse 17:1 of the Quran. Glory to God who made his servant journey by night from Haram Mosque in Mecca to the Farthest Mosque supposedly in Jerusalem. So that narrator never mentioned that, and Zuhri became angry and stopped and said, aren't you going to mention that? Right? And here, what are we looking at in this story? Are we looking at, now that the Dome of the Rock was built, were the Umayyad interested in trying to give it an exclusively Islamic dimension? That is, everything that we know about the rock are from this biblical history or pre-creation history. And is there a need to tie it also to some Islamic figures, including the Prophet Muhammad, or especially the Prophet Muhammad? Because in this way, we can have a direct and legitimate claim to it and not say, oh, you are usurpers. You came and took the biblical heritage and you have nothing to share because you have nothing about you in particular that relate to this place. So probably, very likely, Az-Zuhri was the first person to connect the Dome of the Rock with the Prophet's night journey. And that, if actually is the case, points us more in the direction of the Umayyads having directly or indirectly hands in engineering this religious symbolism of Islam, disseminating stories about why Jerusalem is important and therefore why people need to come to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. Let us not forget that as a result of that, Jerusalem became almost like a mandatory stop for Muslims in Egypt, going overland, in Syria, or even anywhere from the Muslim world that were coming to do the pilgrimage in Mecca via Syria, to stop in Jerusalem as an almost a mandatory stop before going on to fulfill the Hajj. So, by the way, when we talk today about the Hajj to Mecca, in the mind of lots of Muslims, when they go there, they feel they are obliged to also visit Medina. But actually, originally, the Hajj to Mecca did not feature any stop anywhere. But here we see that, especially in medieval literature, that lots of people in Egypt and Syria and from elsewhere as well used to come to Jerusalem, start their Hajj from Jerusalem by donning the ihram in Jerusalem and then starting the journey to that. So all of that, what you see is the result of that kind of Umayyad investment in disseminating all this literature or starting it about why Jerusalem is important for Islam. And obviously, if you want to do that, you need to create your own association with the city, right? Rather not only biblical, distant past kind of association. What we call the Fada'il genre is extremely interesting because it tells us about the spiritual aspect, the religious aspect, what the Muslims really introduced in order to celebrate the significance of certain spots and the city collectively. And there really we open to a world that is for religious studies in particular, but also, when you say that, we also understand the psychology of the Muslims. By the way, there were lots of Muslims who objected to the excessive veneration of Jerusalem, and we have evidence of that. But when you see Muslims objecting to the excessive veneration of Jerusalem, that is a proof that there has been or there was excessive veneration of the city of Jerusalem. And again, as far as we can tell, there seems that the Umayyads had direct hands in trying to engineer a lot of that. How much of these stories about the religious significance of Fada'il of Jerusalem were known before the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque were built? That remains a big question for us. It's more likely that a lot of those legends started to emerge after the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque were built. Some of them actually tell us that whoever said certain things post-dated the construction. So they were born or they were active after, including someone like Zuhri, whose visit to Jerusalem is decades after the Dome of the Rock was built. He wasn't active when the Dome of the Rock was built to say that he could have said this and this could have been tied to the significance of the structure. The other important thing is that when we talk especially about the Dome of the Rock, let's look at what is most apparent in front of us, which unfortunately sometimes scholars don't see the most obvious. It's called the Dome of the Rock. It's not called the Dome of the Prophet or Dome of the Night Journey or Dome of the Ascension or Dome of the Temple. It's called Dome of the Rock, which means it references a sacred site, which is a rock. And here, incidentally, there is next to it Dome of the Ascension, which was built after the Crusader period. We know that because the stones that are used are Crusader stones. There are some still inscriptions, Latin inscriptions and French inscriptions, and some crosses. So that tells us that at one point around the 12th century, the Muslims identified a spot on the Haram from which they believed the Prophet ascended to heaven, and that was different from the Dome of the Rock. So the idea that the Prophet stood on the rock to go to heaven is way, way late, even post-Crusade. There is another one that is Qibla al-Isra, there is Qibla al-Nabi, the Dome of the Prophet. So there is plenty of this kind of conflicting stories, and therefore I go back to that name, Dome of the Rock, references the rock. And if you look at the Fada'il literature, the religious merits of Jerusalem literature, you find tremendous focus on the sanctity of the rock. And you have there a huge spectrum of stories from pre-creation, from the rock being the throne of God, hence the legend in Islam or the explanation and the story that circulated in early Islam, that this footprint that you have on the rock is the footprint of God. That remained to be a story that the Muslims used to tell until it became very problematic to talk about God in anthropomorphic ways. And this is when the Muslims stopped associating that footprint with God, and they got a little confused. Okay, if it's not God, who it is? We have a mid-11th century Muslim pilgrim who was in Jerusalem and who says that this is a footprint of Ishmael. When Abraham tried to sacrifice his son Ishmael, the son was playing around and he stepped on the rock, and that's a footprint. Some other would say it's a footprint of the angel. And later on, when the rock became associated with the Prophet Muhammad, people started to say this is a footprint of the Prophet Muhammad, and then now it is encased. So when you go, you can see it in some kind of an encasement. So here you have the whole story, how certain things, but again, it goes to that rock being originally the throne of God, and then the rock being where supposedly Abraham was about to sacrifice his son. So it was the altar on which, and then the rock was the spot upon which Solomon built the temple. And it goes on till you have in the day of judgment, God is going to come down, sit on the rock, and hold the judgment there. So you see that the tremendous investment are actually in the rock as being what transpires as the most sacred. And if you look around, this is not unique. There is nothing unique about rock that I'm referencing here under the Dome of the Rock in the sense, not unique. There is every unique thing about it, but it's not unique in the sense that if we go a little bit outside of the entire Haram to the Holy Sepulchre, one of the central thing is the rock of the Golgotha. That is, this is where Jesus was crucified, right, on top of a rock. So in some way, the Holy Sepulchre is built on top of a rock in order to shelter and sanctify the rock. And if you go a little bit south of Jerusalem, recently, say, I think if I'm not mistaken, in the 1990s, a church was discovered. We only have the remains of it, but the remains are extremely telling. It's an octagonal building, exactly the same shape like the Dome of the Rock. And supposedly, it is built around a sacred rock that is believed a rock where Mary sat on her way from Nazareth all the way to Bethlehem, where she ended up giving birth to Jesus. This is a Christian tradition. And therefore, the Christians in the 4th century or 5th century, we are not sure exactly when that Kathisma Church was built. built a church in order to sanctify a rock. So that practice of sanctification of rocks was everywhere in the Muslim world when the Muslims took control of Jerusalem and ultimately built the Dome of the Rock. So the Muslims were not unique. It was a widely practiced thing. And here, in relation to a point that I've made earlier, the fascinating thing about this Kathisma Church is that there is actually a mihrab, a direction of prayer for the Muslims in it. So the building is a church, a Christian church that celebrates the rock, sacred rock where Mary sat. And there is a mihrab for the Muslims in it. So did the Muslims turn it into a mosque? Very unlikely. But it means that the Muslims were allowed to come there and worship. And therefore, whoever was in control felt that, okay, we give the Muslims a corner and we allow them to make their own mihrab so that they know the direction of prayer. That what tells us that this church definitely was known to the Muslims, and therefore they used its architecture to build the Dome of the Rock. And all of this points again to Umayyad period, Umayyad influences during Umayyad period, and ideas that were taken. So to go back to your question, what we are looking at here is definitely we can say this was tremendous certainty that the building of the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque gave rise to this economy about stories that needed to be told in order to satisfy either the curiosity or to raise more interest, more sanctification of this place, to draw more people. And we see the same thing definitely about Mecca that happened throughout Islamic history. So that in relationship to Jerusalem started to become more accelerated after those two buildings happened. So all of this again points us to the fact that the Umayyads and the creation of the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque launched this Fada'il, the religious merits of Jerusalem. How much of it existed before? There is plenty of question marks, possibly some of it, and possibly whatever existed was not yet completely embellished, was still rudimentary, and was largely tied to two aspects, as I said before, the biblical aspect and the judgment day. And then the Muslims took that and they elaborated it more. What they added to it, which is expected and which what we see in so many other religious traditions, they start added to it their own experiences in the cities, their own encounters in the city, their own, the stories about exclusive what we call Islamic association with the city. And this is where you start having, as I said earlier, the association of the Prophet, Night Journey with Jerusalem, Ascension with Jerusalem, the fact that certain companions of the Prophet came and lived in Jerusalem and were buried there. So all of a sudden you start having sacred site associated with specific Muslim figure and not simply the biblical past or the end of time future. Now we are starting having the Islamic element, so to speak, or the Islamic depth that speaks of the sanctity of Jerusalem. And that's what is more celebrated in the Fada'il literature that started to be collected in books by the end of the 9th century. This person that I collected and edited his book, his name is al-Walid bin Hamad al-Ramli, who died around 912 and was active in Palestine in the 9th century. He collected all these legends that were around, that were told by preachers in the Umayyad mosques. Some of them were his teachers about the different sanctities of different spots. And what his book is actually important is that tell us that there seems to be pilgrims' itineraries, not simply, these were loose legends that people were telling about different significance of Jerusalem. Those were tied to itineraries that when you come, you have to visit this spot, you have to visit this spot, and you do certain prayers. Most of them are on the Temple Haram area, but some of them were outside, like the well of Siloam, or the spring of Siloam. If you go to the Kidron Valley, also there are certain spots there. So there is plenty of significant sacred sites on the Haram and around it that this Fada'il literature actually speaks about it in terms of a itinerary of pilgrimage that the visitor have to do. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, that created some kind of an objection on the part of other Muslim scholars who felt this veneration of Jerusalem is all fabricated, is not good Islam, so to speak.
So you mentioned how the biblical heritage and sanctity of Jerusalem became superseded or was superseded in the Crusader era, where the focus shifted toward Prophet Muhammad's association with Jerusalem. To round off what has been an enlightening discussion, could you tell us a bit about the socio-political dimensions of this shift at the time of the Crusades? And finally, could you speak a little bit more about scholars, you mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah and others who disagreed with this veneration or excessive veneration of?
Yes. Often in history and religious studies in particular, sometimes we forget how important political factors, social factors, psychological factors are impactful on religious dogma. And in the case of Jerusalem in particular, its significance changed political, religious, social significance, changed in relationship to certain periods, who was in control of the city, what was the level of their investment in the city. So I talked a lot about the Umayyads, which essentially put Jerusalem on a pedestal. The Abbasids came, much less religious investment in Jerusalem. And then the Fatimids came and also much less investment in the political investment in the city of Jerusalem. But the things that once the Umayyads did what they did, the city maintained a tremendous religious significance. And that religious significance started to be deployed in order to harness specific political meanings in different periods, again, depending on the broader context. So when the Crusaders came and occupied Jerusalem in 1099, that kindled a renewed political interest in the city. It didn't awaken the Muslims to the religious significance of Jerusalem. They all knew about its religious significance. But what it kindled is a new political interest in the city. And we see that a lot in the way the Muslim rulers in the second half of the 12th century, and I specifically here reference Nuruddin and Saladin, and how much they wanted to invest in harnessing the political significance of Jerusalem in order to translate into political legitimacy for themselves. And there, at that time, that is the end of the 12th century, beginning of 13th century, we start to see a new way of Muslims, scholars in particular, dealing with the legitimacy and the religious significance of Jerusalem. This older one that I spoke about stayed. You know, once you establish something, it's very hard to remove it. But what we see in this Crusader period on the part of some Muslim scholars is that they became more focused on tying the religious significance of Jerusalem to an exclusive Islamic aspect. And there, for them, the biblical aspect is no more usable. Actually, they objected to it. The Christian aspect, they objected to it. And they said, for Jerusalem to be significant to Islam, it has to come completely from the Quran. So whatever I say about Jerusalem, I have to take from the Quran or from the Sunnah of the Prophet. I cannot take it from anywhere else. So if it comes from the Bible, I have to reject it. If it comes from stories that I don't find any proof or resonance of them in the Quran or the Hadith, I have to reject. And I can only build it on exclusively Islamic sources. So that side of what we call the religious significance of Jerusalem started to show up in certain books of Fada'il that were produced in the 13th century and 14th century. And also that echoes from another point, the objection on the part of those scholars to certain Islamic practice and rituals that the Muslims were doing in Jerusalem. And this tied us to what is known, for instance, in the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah about him objecting, for instance, that the Muslims hold similar rituals during the season of the Hajj in Jerusalem. So instead of them journeying to Mecca to do those rituals, they come to Jerusalem and do those rituals there, including the circumambulation of the rock, including lots of prayers, including what we call the wuquf, which is the prayer while standing, which is done on Mount Arafah near Mecca during the days of the Hajj, and including shaving the head at the end of the Hajj and sacrifice. So we know, for instance, from him and from other scholars like him, that the Muslims used to come and excessively do certain rituals around certain seasons in Jerusalem. And for people like Ibn Taymiyyah, there is no Islamic legitimacy for this. That's his argument. Obviously, the fact that those Muslims are doing, and they are not doing it. We are not talking here about ignorant Muslims. We are also talking about scholars who are coming and doing that. So this is a rift within Islam as whether this is legitimate or not. But Ibn Taymiyyah in particular, because he is coming from that point of view that for Jerusalem to be Islamic and its religious significance to be Islamic, that has to be exclusively based on Islamic sources only and not others. So all these other practices that were done, in the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah and people like him, lacked legitimacy, and therefore he declared all of these practices heretical. So that you have a kind of debate within the Islamic tradition over this excessive veneration of the city of Jerusalem and doing certain ritual there that emanated from this economy that I talked about in trying to sell the city to the Muslims, and having scholars standing up and objecting to it. And today, for instance, there is a debate about whether all this biblical association with the city of Jerusalem, whether it is correct or not, and I'm not going to delve into it. But as far as the Islamic tradition is concerned, Ibn Taymiyyah is not really the representative of the Islamic tradition that speaks about that. Actually, the Fada'il literature is more of a representative of this complexity of the Islamic tradition that espouses, that accepts, that takes over the biblical tradition and argues that Islam fulfills it. Islam inherits it, and it is a foundation of Islam, but also the Muslims are the natural heirs of all of this legacy, and therefore they are continuing it. Ibn Taymiyyah would prefer to have a cut, that is, Islam came to superimpose himself on all of these early forms of religious worship of God as the only legitimate one, and therefore, when it comes to the city of Jerusalem, he axes out all of this biblical recreation, all of this material that has no resonance, no base in the Quran or the Sunnah. And he does that, by the way, not only about Jerusalem, but also about the pilgrimage practices and rituals that were done by Muslims in the city of Hebron, in the sanctuary of Abraham, in this great mosque, Masjid al-Ibrahimi, in the city of Abraham. Supposedly where Abraham and his son and grandson Isaac and Jacob were born, and their wives as well. And we know a lot about that, but that's for another story. So this is a kind of what we call the objection of Ibn Taymiyyah, but that objection is again based on a political realization that started to spread as a result of a very horrible experiences the Muslims had with the Crusaders, which is a period of almost 200 years of war. There was plenty of other things, of friendships, of peaceful relations, of treaties, of coordination and cooperation and exchange of business and science, but it was also dominated by tremendous tension. And some scholars fed into that. And Ibn Taymiyyah definitely is one of them. His teachers were definitely instrumental in creating this kind of world of clash of civilizations, and therefore pitching the legitimacy of religious legitimacy of Jerusalem as necessarily needing exclusive Islamic legitimizers. That comes out of this clash with the Crusaders, and therefore, essentially, in other words, that you have certain Muslim scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah saying that we don't want our Jerusalem to have anything to do with those people. If the way we celebrate and venerate Jerusalem takes a lot of its material from these people, we need to cut it out. And essentially, that's the kind of justification for why you have this trend to say that we cannot use any more stories from the Bible to explain the religious significance of Jerusalem. All of this is fake stuff. We cannot use, for instance, any mention of the temple as legitimacy for why Jerusalem is important for the Muslims. We only need, again, the Quran and the Hadith. And that changes the nature of Jerusalem and also gradually started to create new realities about its importance in Islam.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed your insights, Professor, and I've reached the end of my questions. So if there is anything that you want to mention before closing, I'll give you that opportunity and then I'll round it off.
The last probably remark is that when we talk of Jerusalem, because I work on it a lot, I study it a lot, I realize that sometimes as scholars, we get carried away by focusing on certain elements more than other elements. What always attracts me to any city, let alone a city like Jerusalem, is how much our scholarship tends to exaggerate certain dimensions at the expense of other dimensions. You know, in the final analysis, I said it in so many other contexts. Jerusalem, after all, is a city, and not only a sacred city. You know, that's one of its characteristics, is being sacred, but also it was just any city. We need to keep in mind the fact that, like any cities, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody who lives in Jerusalem is obsessing about its religious significance. And that was, or that religion was always a factor that hegemonized life in the city at the expense of everything else, especially in the Islamic tradition. You know, after all, people lived in the city, traded in the city. They were not aware of other things that were happening. Pilgrimage to the city was seasonal. That is, there were certain seasons when people come on pilgrimage. So it wasn't that like today, you would find pilgrim everywhere all the time. You know, the modern facets of tourism are extremely misleading for us as historians. So always to caution the reader, the listener, that we need to factor in the fact that Jerusalem, beside the fact that often we exaggerate its religious significance, is also just a city. And it has dirty roads like any other city. Its people are not necessarily always ethical and moral. So we cannot put Jerusalem in a different reality beyond the reality of other cities. But at the same time, many cities don't have that dimension, what we call spiritual dimension. And that's what complicates it when it comes to places like Jerusalem, is that it's at the same time reality, at the same time idea, and they feed into each other and they circulate. So the idea can create reality, and that reality becomes what people live rather than what people see, especially when someone goes there expecting to see things that come out from what they read about it rather than what the people there who live experience. And all of these things are fascinating when you start thinking of them. So that's an aspect that we need to keep in mind as we think of a city like Jerusalem. And also that sometimes we try to talk as scholars with certain coherence about certain places, but we need to also keep in mind that every story, however coherent we render it, is much more complex and opens up to lots of contradictions. And that as historians, we say certain things based on the scholarship and the sources that we have at our disposal. say we might discover new sources in 5 to 10 years that might change completely our opinion. And therefore we have to backtrack and reconsider lots of assumptions and explanations and speculations. And this is more the case about Jerusalem than about other cities, because usually we are not asked to talk about other cities the way we are asked to talk about Jerusalem. And therefore, we tend to speculate. We tend to give partly certain liberty for our imaginations as historians to fill in the blank. So a lot, again, of what I said is tentative in the sense that it depends on the kind of sources we have at our disposal, that if some new material comes to light, we might be forced and change it. So the reader, the listener needs to be attentive that when we tell a story as historians, this is not certainty. This is plausible based on the current evidence.
Again, I thank you for your time, Professor. Thank you so much for sharing your time today.